Center for the Study of World Religions, Harvard Divinity School.
Hey, everybody. Simon and I were just reminiscing about how we know each other and the stages along our journey together. So, welcome this afternoon. My name is Charles Stang. I serve as the director here at the Center for the Study of World Religions, and it is a great pleasure to have Simon Cox here as a visiting scholar all month. This is his single public event, and I'm really looking forward to it. And we're also experimenting with this format of doing dialogues. Now, in Simon's case, he and I have done this a few times, all online, I think, right?
No, we've done it in person at Esalen. We've done it in person.
About your book?
About my book. Oh, no, actually, yeah, I think you're right.
I think, we've certainly had a lot of in-person time. But when it comes to your book, I think this is our first in-person dialogue around your book. And of course, we're talking about now your new book. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. So Simon is a visiting scholar. Simon and I have known each other since 2016, where we met at a conference at the Esalen Institute. And these are the details I was just rehearsing with Simon. He shared at that point a paper that would eventually grow into his first book, A Genealogy of the Subtle Body. I believe, Greg, you were also at that event. And he presented that paper thinking it would be prefatory to a dissertation that he will describe. And in the wake of the meeting, he decided, in fact, this was the dissertation he needed to write. So I saw this first book in Nietzsche expand over the years. So Simon and I have talked about his first book a number of times, and I reviewed it in the Harvard Theological Review. We're not going to go through that because what we really want to do is use the first book as a launching pad to talk about his second. But I'm going to start, Simon. Well, first of all, maybe I'll just give you the floor if there's anything you want to say by way of introduction before I launch into my first question.
Thanks for having me, Charlie. I'm really happy to be here, see a lot of familiar and unfamiliar faces. We met in 2016 at Esalen. I had written a little paper called A Genealogy of the Subtle Body, and it was just a preface to kind of clarify the term subtle body for the dissertation I wanted to write, which was comparing classical Chinese and classical Tibetan formulations of the subtle body, specifically about techniques of cultivating inner fire and circulation of this inner fire in Chinese and Tibetan stuff. Reaching the halfway point in grad school, I realized that was a huge project, and instead I took this little paper I had written that was pretty well received by people like Greg and Charlie at Esalen, and I just made it into my whole dissertation. I finished grad school in 2019, and I moved to Canada, where my wife and I have a kung fu school. So that's kind of my main day job. But Charlie and my advisor, Jeff Kreipel at Esalen, have kind of kept me with one foot in that kind of academic world, mostly through the Esalen Institute, where I'm a research fellow right now, and through bringing me to do stuff like this. So I'm super grateful for that, because if it weren't for them, I would just be a kind of kung fu teacher out in the wilderness. But I'm able to kind of maintain a presence in spaces like this and have this kind of really amazing intellectual camaraderie, which is super enriching. I've been having a great time here at the center.
Great. Well, then let's get right to it. So this book is a genealogy, your first book, and your second book is a kind of braided genealogy. So a genealogy needs to have an ancestor, and in both cases, as you'll tell us more, that ancestor is Aristotle for both subtle body and energeia, which you'll speak about today. But you follow a method in this genealogy of tracking the phrase subtle body. That's the lens through which you pursue this genealogy or the method. And you and I have talked about this, and I mentioned it in my review, I think, that one of the limitations of this method of genealogy that focuses on the actual phrase subtle body is that it's a method that focuses on the phrase rather than the concept. I feel I'm bungling this. Let me first of all say I wanted to push you to consider a method that focuses on the concept of the subtle body. What I mean by that is that there might be a considerable body of literature and reflection on the subtle body that never uses the phrase subtle body. So your genealogy limits itself to the phrase subtle body and shows up a certain amount of things. Much of it is a kind of Neoplatonic storyline. But I was pushing you to think about what would it mean to do a broader conceptual genealogy of the subtle body. Now, you have very clever answers to this, this challenge, and I'm wondering if you could reflect on that challenge in light of what you're pursuing in your second book.
Cool. So when you're in graduate school and you're kind of trying to put together a dissertation idea, there's typically, you're encouraged, at least this is my experience, to find a historical subject you're going to study and then find a methodological lens through which you're going to look at it. And I had a really cool historical subject. I lived in China for 6 years, and I'd lived in a Taoist monastic context and done all of these different kind of energetic cultivation practices, and I was super well versed in the literature in Taoism on subtle body stuff and the cultivation of inner fire and these sorts of things. And then when I went to grad school, I studied classical Tibetan because I wanted a kind of point of comparison. And a few years in, my Tibetan was kind of okay, and I could actually start reading these tantric texts on the cultivation of inner fire and the circulation of energy and that sort of stuff. And so I was like, okay, I have my project. I have my historical topic. I have the languages. I have the historical competencies. But now I need kind of just one last thing. It's this term subtle body between these two historical worlds. And so I was like, surely someone's written history of the subtle body. Someone's made sense of this really messy concept, because it just shows up all over the place. It shows up in like contemporary like French postmodern theory. It shows up in kind of any area studies on East Asian stuff. It's super popular term in the New Age. So it was just everywhere. And when I looked, I found no one actually had really made sense of the term. And so that's why I went and I did a really, really narrow kind of focus on just the term subtle body. And I traced it back to the place it was coined, which is in Cambridge in the 1670s. Ralph Cudworth, he was the leader of the Cambridge Platonists. And like that's like where the term comes from. He's actually translating Aristotle, this term soma leptomeres, from Aristotle's book on the soul. And then I just traced that specific term forward through history. And I knew that this is like really, really kind of closing your eyes to huge amounts of stuff in the kind of surrounding areas. But to be like totally candid, I was in grad school and I was kind of like writing under the gun. I wanted to finish this thing before my funding ran out and do it in a reasonable amount of time so my wife wouldn't leave me. And so I was like, okay, I'll like, even though I'm doing a really, really narrow thing that I'm just ignoring so much of the relevant stuff, I'm just going to stick with this really, really narrow method just to get this done. And somehow Oxford picked it up and actually published it as a book, which really amazed me. So I was really aware of the limitations of this kind of method. And so, yeah. Charlie and I have actually discussed this in a couple other contexts, this sort of idea of tracing, you're just tracing a word through history, or are you tracing a concept through history? And they're kind of two different things. And so that's something I've really taken to heart in the development of this new book I'm writing, which is not a history of the subtle body anymore. I'm focusing now in this new book on the history of the concept of energy in the West and the concept of Qi in the East. And they're kind of, so I'm doing genealogies of both. I go to the earliest place we see energy, which again turns out to be Aristotle and Energia. And then I go to Qi, which we have in the kind of oracle bone inscriptions from the Shang dynasty 2,300 years ago. And kind of, it's a very different project from the subtle body one, because there's huge amounts of secondary scholarship on both of these things. So with the subtle body thing, I was really just reading primary sources pretty much the whole time. This thing, I'm absorbing tons of secondary scholarship. But what I do, and so the kind of concept of energy and its history really emblemizes the limitations of a genealogical method, because I start in Aristotle. I start with energeia, and then this term goes forward in the kind of Hellenic, like Greek and Latin intellectual traditions. Energeia is transformed significantly by Plotinus, and then he actually uses it more times than Aristotle ever does in his work. And then in Hermeticism, and kind of Greek Eastern Orthodox Christianity, John Philoponus is kind of one of these final figures in antiquity. And then what I'm doing is I'm tracing its translation into Latin. And there, just because it's so cool, I don't really have a good reason for this, but I'm looking at Marsilio Ficino's Latin translation of the Corpus Hermeticum. And just from what I've done kind of cursory research on this, but Ficino appears to translate this one term, energeia, into 3 different Latin terms, kind of opus, operari, actus, potentia, or actualitas, this kind of, so it kind of splinters into a broader semantic range. And then that's where you're like, well, are we really still talking about the same idea anymore once you're starting translating across these divides? And then when I get to, then subsequently in the birth of modern science, these 3 kind of Latin terms splinter into like a dozen kind of vernacular terms in French, German, and English. And then what I do in my book is I take it all the way to then the Japanese and Chinese translation projects in the 19th century, where they're translating kind of science textbooks and stuff like this. And by that time, it's like, we're obviously not talking about the same thing anymore. So my new book is kind of like a meta-theoretical exercise in the where taking genealogy to like its breaking point and seeing where this method like breaks down. And this was, I was really inspired in this dimension of it by this kind of Gilles Deleuze's like analysis of what a true genealogy is. I hope I get this right, but he says that a real genealogy is simultaneously an inquiry into the origin of certain values that's also an inquiry into the value of origins. So it's kind of, we're doing the genealogical work, but at the end of the day, it's like, what are we really getting out of this? And so that's where I'm framing my book out with my own personal experience. So my introductory chapter talks about my time in China and essentially getting kind of like zapped with energy in a sort of Taoist initiation transmission experience. And so that's where I kind of, because I did my PhD under Jeff Kripal. I don't know if you guys know him, but he's like, you can't just do history. You have to tell your own story. You have to show people what's at stake for you. And so in these energetic discourses, I love doing the nerdy historical stuff, but it also kind of, at the end of the day, it's about my own kind of experience and making sense of that.
All right, thank you, Simon. So the new book is structured as kind of alternating chapters on either the history of energeia or Qi, so moving back and forth between West and East from antiquity to the present. And this morning when we were chatting, you said that the place where these 2 independent genealogies cross is when the Jesuits first arrive in China. Now, I want to invite you to talk about that moment, but I also want to invite you to say more about the question I posed to you this morning. So this morning I said to you, could it possibly be that there's an earlier moment where energy and Qi cross? And that is the, well, to me famous, but probably to most people not particularly well known, Christian body of literature from China during the Tang Dynasty. So this is from the 7th through 9th century, the so-called Jingzhao materials. If any of you are curious about this, the stele inscription in the CSWR stairwell is a facsimile of this monument erected in the year 781. These are Christians who made it to the Tang Dynasty and tried to express their theology in Chinese. So my question to Simon was, had energeia come with these Christians, these Eastern Christians, to China centuries before the Jesuits? So I'd like to ask you to respond either to this hypothesis that there was an earlier crossing, and then also to speak about the peculiarities of the Jesuit encounter.
Cool. Yeah. Charlie and I, we had a little conversation this morning, kind of preparation for this thing, kind of throwing ideas back and forth. And yeah, I mentioned that it was the Jesuits was the first place where this contact really begins with this energy and Qi back and forth sort of thing that then subsequently carries on. And so yeah, my book is structured where they begin as 2 independent streams, energy and Qi, and then they intersect in the 1600s with the Jesuit mission to Rome, to Beijing. And then energy kind of goes to, I trace energy and its history in China, and then trace Qi and its developments in European thought. And so they kind of cross and go back in the other directions. And it ends with this sort of where Qi becomes a loan word in English. We don't translate it anymore. Everybody knows what Qi is. You can find shirts on Amazon say like got Qi and stuff like that. And energy now is a super common term in Chinese. Every time Xi Jinping talks about all the wonderful things China's doing in the world, he talks about Zheng Liang, or like positive energy. which is a term actually out of the Chinese New Age. But then, yeah, so Charlie challenged me. He was like, oh, well, what about the Jingzhou stuff from the Tang Dynasty? Because there was this earlier period of kind of Christian contact. And yeah, I was super excited when I first arrived here at the center. In the stairwell, there's a full length kind of facsimile of they call it the Xi'an stele, or the Jingzhou stele, which was erected by Nestorian Christians in present day Xi'an, Chang'an back then in 781, which was this really interesting period when the kind of Abbasid Caliphate was sweeping over Persia, and lots of Persian kind of almost like refugees were coming over to the court of the Tang Dynasty in Xi'an. So this is the same period when Manichaeism goes to China, Nestorian Christianity comes to China. It's a really, really interesting time. And sure enough, yeah, when I just looking at it in the staircase, at the top of the second column is the word qi. And qi actually is all over the Xi'an stele. And it's actually a specific kind of qi that they use there called yuan qi, which I was going to talk about today, which is a really kind of interesting sort of cosmological or theological development of the concept of qi during the Tang Dynasty. It's called like originary qi. This term goes back much earlier in Chinese history, but it's in the Tang Dynasty that a specific piece was written in Taoism called the Yuan Qi Lun, or the kind of discourses on original qi. And in the context of the Xi'an stele, this yuan qi, or originary qi, is being used to kind of paraphrase a phrase from Genesis, the sort of darkness on the face of the deep. So this is a very early point of contact and a really interesting theological use of qi to represent these Western things. So I haven't looked, this was just a couple hours ago, but I'm going to now look and kind of reread this Xi'an stele, because I think, yeah, probably the discourses around Pneuma and Spiritus and qi are probably right in there. And that precedes the Jesuit contact by almost a millennium. Yeah, very cool.
Do you want to say anything about the Jesuit encounter briefly? And then I'm going to bring you back to late antiquity and Christian understandings of energia.
Yeah. So the Jesuits go to China in, well, actually, the very end of the 16th and the beginning of the 17th centuries. They're there just a few decades before the fall of the Ming Dynasty and the rise of the Qing Dynasty, which they handle really, really skillfully. So my book has this insane historical scope. I'm going from Aristotle to Xi Jinping. And like I said, there's tons of secondary scholarships that I'm referencing, bodies of scholarship in this work. And there's two areas that just have massive secondary scholarships, and one is a kind of like scientific revolution and the kind of discursive formation of concepts like mechanical force coming out of these energy discourses, and the other is the Jesuit encounter in Rome, in Beijing. Again, there's so much scholarship on this, and like really, really good stuff, and even stuff in English. It's kind of low-hanging fruit. And there's a wonderful recent book called A Global Enlightenment by Alexander Stotman that really goes in detail on the kind of Jesuit encounter and the involvement of, I mean, the Jesuits, even in the 1700s, were directly involved in kind of mesmeric and Kabbalistic circles back in Europe. And they were using mesmerism, they were using animal magnetism and Kabbalah to interpret the stuff they were seeing, like articles kind of in these kind of Jesuit proceedings of their ethnographies, essentially, of Taoist monks doing kind of Qigong-style movements. And they're already in the 1700s interpreting those in terms of animal magnetism and being like, these are the same things. So Stotman's book does wonderful service going in detail on that stuff. And so those are the dimensions that I'm kind of exploring, but it's not really, I'm not doing a ton more primary scholarship there. I'm really kind of rehashing stuff that's already been done, but incorporating it into this much larger narrative.
Well, then let's cut back west, but the east side of west. Let's talk about not the Jesuits, the Western Christians, but the Eastern Christians. So you are tracing the genealogy of the word energia from Aristotle through Plotinus, where you've already said you see a kind of explosion of this term, and then into Eastern Christian theology. What can you tell us about what happens to energia on that trajectory from Plotinus into Eastern Christian thought?
Cool. Yeah. Again, this is somewhere where there's wonderful secondary scholarship on this. Something Bradshaw, I forget what his first name is, but one of the books he wrote is called Aristotle East and West, and it's literally just a history of the term energeia out of Aristotle, from Aristotle to about the year 1400, and it becomes really important through one of Charlie's main favorite figures, Pseudo-Dionysius, who really kind of articulates it in the context of Eastern Orthodox Christianity. And so, so doing my kind of like really narrow genealogy thing, I go back to Aristotle, and you look in his works, and energeia shows up like 671 times, something like that. Aristotle has a lot of works. It's two volumes like this size is the kind of contemporary collected works of Aristotle. Plotinus's work is much smaller, the Enneads, yet in that energeia shows up 783 times. So much smaller work, way more uses of energeia in Plotinus. And I'm talking about the transformations that happen. So energeia is in Aristotle, but it's in his, I don't know if you guys know that the sort of transmission history of the Aristotle's corpus is really kind of sketchy. He appears to have written all of his stuff, but what we have from him are his so-called esoteric works. He wrote a lot of public works like dialogues and stuff like that, but they're almost entirely lost. We have one sort of the Protrepticus in like pretty okay shape, but all of his other dialogues are gone. We don't know what they are, where they are. And so the only stuff we have are his kind of esoteric works, were his kind of like lecture notes. And they wound up kind of being given to his student Theophrastus, and then kind of through book dealers, they wound up in kind of Asia Minor, and then eventually made themselves back to Athens. And then when the Roman conqueror Sulla conquered Athens, he brought them as part of his booty back to Rome, where they were systematized and translated. And so this is hundreds of years after Aristotle's death, is the only time when the works we know as Aristotle actually start kind of hitting the market. There's some scholarly kind of dissensus on this, but that's the general shape of the story. And so Aristotle coins the term energeia as a systematic term as far as we can tell, and then it's hundreds of years no one uses it. And so it's only with the sort of a post-Sulla publication of Aristotle's works by this figure Andronicus of Rhodes and Tyrannion of Amasis that we begin to see energeia being picked up in kind of the contemporary Roman philosophy of the day, in Stoicism and Epicureanism and stuff like that. And so it doesn't really have very much of a development between Aristotle and Plotinus several hundred years later. Is everything I'm saying checking out with you, Charlie?
Well, I mean, this particular chapters in the story I don't know well, so I'm learning from you. I can't fact check you on the spot on any of this stuff. See, but maybe just to fast forward a bit, to ask you to say, like, give us a flavor of what, not just the names and the transmission channels, but how does the concept of energy change from Aristotle to the Neoplatonists to a Christian Neoplatonist? Does the concept of energy meaningfully evolve? And if so, how?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, like I said, there's not a lot that happens, but then the change is quite large when Plotinus really picks this term up. And so for Aristotle, energeia it's a really technical term that just refers to the activity of a being, the proper activity of a being. It's kind of part of this pair, dunamis, energeia, in Aristotle. You have this sort of a certain potential. Humans have the potential for intellectual activity. My cat does not. And so the energeia of a human would be engaging in this intellectual activity. That's the activity we're doing. The energeia of my cat would be climbing a tree. The energeia of the eye is to see. And so this is the kind of technical Aristotelian usage as it shows up in his corpus. By the time we get to Plotinus, it changes dramatically as Plotinus incorporates it into this sort of like the Neoplatonic vision of the cosmos, of these kind of like different layers of reality, from the one to the sort of cosmic mind or nous to the soul to the kind of multifarious world of phenomenal reality. And so, yeah, Charlie was, again, kind of putting a fine point on this. Does Plotinus talk about the energeia of the one? And this is something I really need to go back to Plotinus and look at, because Plotinus, he talks about the energeia, the activity of the mind and of the soul and of kind of the animal world for sure. But the one, does it act or not? This is something that shows up a lot actually in Greg's recent book, this like activity of the one cascading into a sort of a monism. So anyway, this is a kind of deep theological point that I need to do some more work on, but this is how energeia changes now. It's not just the activity of a being, it's kind of the emanation of a plane of reality. And so that's where energeia begins to kind of take on the flavor of the modern way we use it. And then in kind of Charlie's guide, Pseudo-Dionysius, it has these much more kind of modern qualities. Could you kind of describe what develops in Pseudo-Dionysius?
So Pseudo-Dionysius is a 6th century Christian author heavily influenced by Neoplatonism. He's writing under the name, a pseudonym, Dionysius the Areopagite from the 1st century, a disciple of Paul. This body of literature, this corpus appears in the 6th century, and nobody knows who wrote it. Now, as to its kind of thought world, he coins the term hierarchy. So he coins the idea of a kind of ordered level of reality that the order of the angels and the order of the church, and they mirror each other. Now that's important because through this hierarchy, he says, moves an energia, an energy. And this energy, he says, is light and love, and this energy is Christ. So this is a kind of Christian philosophy of the 6th century in which Christ is not significant as a historical personage who died to atone for sins, but Christ is a kind of energy moving through the church. And so the significance of that for Christians means what it means to be a Christian is to channel the energy of Christ. You have to kind of receive it, allow it to move through you, and pass it on. And this, I gather from your genealogy, strikes you as a kind of curiously modern and like an anticipation of the modern view of energy, but from the 6th century Christian East. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, especially the way you just described it, where energy becomes Christ, love, and light. I mean, this is kind of straight out of a New Age book section in the 1990s almost. So yeah, no, totally, yeah. So this is where, because in Aristotle, it has nothing to do basically with how we think of energy now, but already by the kind of Neoplatonic and Hermetic usages, it begins to take on these much more modern qualities. And really good. Iamblichus also is a big fan of energeia in this term. In these terms.
Can I ask you to now move back east, the real east, not the Christian East. So, can you tell us in your preliminary stages of your research, what are some of the things about Qi that differentiate it from the Western notion of energy? Or what are some surprising features of Qi that you'd like to highlight for readers who are going to be new to this genealogy? Bring us into this world.
So Qi, and again here, I'm hugely grateful to 2 volumes from the 1990s. There's one called Qi no Shiso, which is in Japanese. It's kind of whole history anthology of the concept of Qi through Chinese history. And then there's the slightly more recent book just called Qi. Doesn't even have a subtitle. It's just called Qi. It's an edited volume by Caifang Liu and kind of other editors, and it's really, really detailed of the intellectual history of Qi in Chinese culture. So those are kind of my guide maps as I'm going through this stuff. I'm using those to explore into these deeper topics. And Qi, again, this is something, it became a loanword surprisingly late, and it's not until the 1970s that Qi goes from being a kind of word that we always translate as kind of spirit, or Carl Jung actually translates it as ether a lot, interestingly enough. But we stopped translating it in the 70s, which is kind of 1965 is when finally the kind of Chinese Exclusion Act, all of its stipulations are finally lifted. And within 10 years, you have like a Chinese restaurant in every little town in the United States. There's this huge kind of David Carradine's Kung Fu, Bruce Lee, Esalen. And so it's in this context that Qi goes from being a foreign concept to a loanword. And so again, it's something that's conflated with energy. When we hear Qi, we generally know what we're talking about. But if you begin to look at Qi as a kind of concept out of Chinese intellectual history, I characterized it to one of my friends the other day as like the quintessential empty signifier of Chinese thought, because it's such a semantically broad and plastic term that it's taken on kind of every sort of shade of meaning you can imagine. Like, there's no term with a similar kind of like semantic plasticity. Maybe the term God in Western thought or something is something that also has this kind of like massive range of different meanings. So this is where kind of going back to the earliest stuff is really useful here, because Qi shows up in the Warring States period philosophy. This is kind of like 300 BC. In forms that are very similar to like ancient Greek atomism, like Democritus. The kind of some early renditions of Qi look exactly like that. A contemporary sinologist, Benjamin Schwartz, translates this early Qi. He says it's more actually like apeiron, this term out of, was it Anaximenes who did the apeiron, or was it Anaximander? Yeah, okay, I was confused, these guys. Yeah. So peiras means like a limitation or a border, and apeiron is just that without a border. So it's kind of a stand-in term for something, which is like the substrate of all reality. So it's sort of like a neutral monism, kind of, in a sense, I think. And so it has this massive, broad semantic range, but that's a kind of my modern view. For most of Chinese history, the meaning of it was very, very simple and determined, because in the early Han Dynasty, the scholar Xu Shen wrote a book called the Suowenjieze, is sort of like explanations of the Chinese characters. And so this is kind of 250 BC or so. He writes this book that is just kind of an analysis of all of the characters in the Chinese language. And he tells you where they all came from and what they all mean. And there's an entry for Qi, and it's super clear. He's like, the earliest meanings of Qi, it was like a cloud or a vapor or a mist. And so for almost all of Chinese history, that's accepted as the originary semantic range of Qi, and everything kind of evolves from there. But then in the late 19th century, the late 1800s, early 20th century, scholars began recognizing these kind of little shards of bone, or the plastron, the kind of chest of a turtle, that were inscribed with Chinese characters. And they came to recognize that these were actually the kind of lost oracle bone texts of the Shang dynasty. And these were actually a very, very early form of Chinese, dating back to about 1300 BC, that long predated Xu Shen and his analysis of Qi. And now we've collected thousands and thousands of these oracle bone texts, and they've really problematized our idea of what Qi actually is. So in the Suowenjieze, Xu Shen, he was right about like 80% of Chinese characters. He was pretty correct. But now there's a lot of really cool scholarship going on, kind of re-envisioning the origin of Chinese characters in light of these oracle bone texts. And one of the 20% of characters that he got wrong is Qi. And there's a lot of scholarly debate over what the early kind of predecessors of the concept of Qi actually are. And so this is something I'm going to kind of cover in detail in my book. Already by the 1930s, there were multiple schools of thought on what Qi originally was. But again, this is sort of like my kind of method takes the sort of genealogical method to its logical conclusion and then explodes it. And then you realize that the whole method of genealogy is based on the logical fallacy, the genetic fallacy. But I think maybe that's part of my meta kind of theoretical critique. Maybe every method is at its core a logical fallacy. I don't know.
All right, I'm not going to pick that up. Instead, I want to ask you to reflect on the significance of either of your books for people outside of the scholarly readership. So a lot of what you've given us is very detailed scholarly genealogy, names, texts, lines of transmission, evolutions of terms. For people who consider themselves as working with energy or Qi, or for that matter, subtle bodies, what do you think the significance of your genealogies, the significance is? What even if, not one lesson, but what are some of the things that you think might matter to people who have an investment in these as realities with which they negotiate?
Yeah, that's a really important question, actually, that Jeff Kripal was always making sure I was aware of, at least. That was kind of on the back of my mind as I was working on my subtle body book. And that's where I'm starting my subtle energy book talking about my own experience, getting a little zap energy. We call it energy. What the hell is this thing? And so the genealogy is an exercise in going back and just sort of like really kind of going through the ideas and the terms with like a fine-tooth comb. And I'm really inspired here by a phrase out of Confucius in the Analects 13:3. He says, "Ming bu zheng, zi yan bu shun." He says, if names are not rectified, then language cannot be smooth. And then he says, "Yan bu shun, zi shi bu cheng." And so if language is not smooth, then matters cannot be accomplished. And this is kind of how I felt in my own practice with these sorts of things. As a practitioner, someone who meditates and does these subtle, energetic, subtle body practices, I really wanted a higher degree of kind of rigor and sophistication in how I was thinking through these terms that I was kind of employing in my practice. Because, I mean, that's just sort of my path. And in the place I lived in China, my teacher was like actively anti-intellectual, apophatic mystic. He told me I read too much. He actively disliked books, but then behind my back, he would shame other students for not studying as hard as I did. So he's just gaslighting everybody. But it's for me, because I'm someone I really like thrive in this kind of intellectual content, and so I find it super interesting, and I feel like it informs my practice in a really useful way. And I know some other people will feel like that, and I know other people will feel the complete opposite and be like, "This is a complete waste of time," and that's perfectly fine too. And so I want to make a point, though, in my book that I have that kind of rhetorical space for both of those positions. So, like, this is a genealogy, but you can kind of throw it on the funeral pyre if it doesn't work for you, you know?
Well, yeah, I don't want to give everybody that option on your behalf. I feel like what I'm hearing from you is, if not an insistence, at least an invitation that sort of rigorous thinking about the terms of your practice stand to enrich your practice. Now, this is not always a point that's welcomed among contemporary practitioners, certainly in the West, especially in the New Age, who I think are frustrated by genealogies and taxonomies and that kind of rigorous attention to terms and language. So I actually think the provocation or the invitation is an important one, and you should sort of try to hold your ground. But I wonder also whether you feel that there is, how do you incorporate the sophistication and precision of practice into the scholarly genealogy? Do you find that does anything change when you are dealing with scholars who themselves have a long history of practice, whether those are Western scholars or I know you read and work with both Chinese and Japanese scholarship. So how does the practice infuse any of the scholarship you're working with?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, actually. I think when practitioners are kind of turned off of scholarship like this, they're not necessarily turned off by the scholarship. They're turned off oftentimes by a kind of tone of derision that can accompany this stuff, where it's like, if you're not engaging on this intellectual level, then you don't know what the hell you're talking about, sort of thing. And so, this is the main thing I've observed with like scholar practitioners. It's not like because you meditate, you're a certain level of consciousness and you can understand these things, but it's because you do practices as well. You have a certain level of rhetorical generosity that you're willing to extend to people who are engaging these things practically, if not at the same level of intellectual rigor as you are. So yeah, I guess this topic we're talking about now is kind of central to this sort of the Esalen world that Charlie and I are both involved in, because Esalen has been this place that has lots of Eastern practices came there in the counterculture, and especially during that time period, it stood as this place where there was kind of rigorous, kind of intellectual engagement with this stuff going on. The last chapter of my Subtle Body book, I talk about Esalen. I talk about this Stanford Indologist Frederick Spiegelberg, who is coming there and giving lectures on terms out of Sanskrit like Sukshma Sharira and the subtle body. He was doing this already in 1962. And so Esalen always kind of has stood for a place in America that has both a kind of a very openness to practice, but also the aspirations of kind of really sophisticated intellectual rigor, I guess. And so, yeah, those are kind of two things I am trying to balance in my scholarship, because my tendency as a scholar is to just ignore all that stuff and not talk about it. But then Jeff is always like, no, you have to talk about yourself. You have to talk about what this actually means, why it matters to you. And I think that's really, really valuable. So that's my way of doing it. I'm doing the genealogy stuff, and I'm letting that be, and letting that be historical. But then I'm framing my book out with the introduction and in the conclusion with the more kind of confessional dimension of my own life story and why these things matter to me.
And for those of you who haven't seen Simon's first book, it's structured, it has an interesting structure because Simon, the main chapters are these genealogical chapters, but interspersed with short vignettes about his own life of, and often like your early life, which set you on the path to pursuing the subtle body. And then the two streams kind of merge at the end of the book where you speculate and offer your own sort of constructive philosophical position. It looks like you're playing with the two streams again in your second book, but you're organizing them differently. You're going to do it in the beginning and the end and leave the meat of the book, so to speak, to be scholarly genealogy. Did I hear you right?
Yeah, I actually hadn't made that connection, but you're totally right, Charlie. It's still, it's again the same kind of morphology, of multiple streams converging at the end, collapsing in on one another sort of thing. Yeah.
Well, I'm sure that there are plenty of people in the audience who will have questions for you. So I'm going to maybe ask my last question now. It's a pretty open-ended one, which is, and I hope this isn't unfair, because we're here to talk about a book not yet written, right? You're in the process of this book.
Big time. Yeah.
And when you showed me the basic outline for this thing and the scope, and I love the inversion in the 20th century, the way that you trace Qi in the West and energy in the East. It's going to be great fun, and I love that it brings us up to contemporary China. But I'm wondering if now, just from a high altitude point of view on your own work, you now have this book done, Subtle Body, another dual genealogy. What do you think these are a part of? What would you describe as your kind of research portfolio and direction, of which these are steps or parts? Where are you going? What's next?
I can't help but, again, this is with reference to my advisor, Jeff Kripal, I can't help but think in terms of trilogies. He's writing a trilogy right now called The Super Story. And he just sent it off to UChicago Press, and he sent me the manuscript, and I've been reading through it. And it's kind of really cool and amazing, and it's really a culmination of his scholarship. And I asked him when he's planning on finishing it, and he said, well, I think when I finish it, I might die. So I'm not in a huge hurry. And with Jeff, he says, like, you can never, there's always a both and with Jeff. So he's joking, and he's maybe not joking too. So I take it seriously. But that has inspired and kind of shaped how I've thought about these sorts of things. And my first book is on the subtle body, and my second book is kind of on subtle energy. And in kind of classical Tibetan renderings of subtle anatomy, really developing in the 12th century and then going forward, there's a pretty standardized way of writing texts about the subtle body. And there were three categories that they used: Ta, Lung, Tigle. Ta are the channels of the body. Lung is the winds that flow through the channels. And Tigle are, well, they're these kind of congealed essences within the body. In practices, tigles are little balls of light that you kind of move around through your body, but also the whole cosmos itself is just one massive tigle. So it's this thing with a very kind of multivalent microcosmic, macrocosmic kind of correspondences. And so, yeah, I've never answered a question like this before, Charlie, but this is kind of very, very abstract now in my mind, but there is some idea of some sort of trilogy that comes out of this, from the subtle body to the subtle energy to some sort of thing that has some kind of like isomorphism with the concept of tigle out of Tibetan thought. And my first thought was a sort of something more about like spirit planes, kind of astral travel stuff that Aleister Crowley really kind of turned me on to when I was studying his stuff for my subtle body book. But that's kind of where I see this going. I have my weekly chats with Michael Murphy at Esalen, and he's always encouraging me in these directions as well, and encouraging me to think bigger and to be more ambitious. So I think this subtle energy book is pretty ambitious, sufficiently ambitious for Mike, hopefully. Yeah.
All right, I think we are at time. Simon, one thing that pleases me a great deal is that you have showcased your encyclopedic knowledge. The range you have is just truly amazing, and he wears his learning. He has a light touch with it, but it's all over everything he does and in every conversation you have with Simon. But you can also see that he has a humility to him alongside that encyclopedic knowledge. Thank you all so much for coming out. We will linger here for a few minutes, and then I will have to pull Simon for a dinner. But please join me in thanking Simon for this great conversation.
Thank you, guys. That was really cool.
cswr.hds.harvard.edu, copyright 2025, the President and Fellows of Harvard College.